Chapter 1. The Journey. Thomas sat patient on the black wrought iron bench, swinging his legs to and fro. This was due to a combination of excitement and just because he could. He was 12 years old, and this was going to be the first real adventure on his own. His mother sat beside him, holding a crocodile skin handbag and tapping her fingers on the top nervously. This had been a present from her brother that he brought back from one of his many trips to Africa. He was an exotic animal vet and often travelled to remote areas with wildlife experts to help save endangered species. Veronica, his mother, had questioned her brother about this token bag, since it did not seem to fit his philosophy of protecting animals by turning some into handbags for the high street shops in the Western world. He explained to her that the crocodile who had supplied the skin for the bag was already dead and had passed away with old age. The local natives, seeing an opportunity to generate an income, skinned the animal and sold the skin to another tribe who were making bags. So, as he said, the purchase of the bag was supporting two tribes and really a much needed boost to the local economy. Her brother's love of animals was a trait that Thomas seemed to have inherited, sometimes to the extreme. His mother was keen to encourage her son's interest in wildlife, but when he brought home 2 rats that he'd found in the nearby fields, and 2 weeks later they gave birth to a large litter of more rats, his mother decided his zeal had gone a little too far and suggested it might be best to take them back to the fields where they belonged. "But the orcs will get the babies and eat them if someone doesn't look after them," complained Thomas to his mother. She explained to him that it was part of nature's food chain. She went on to say, if the hawk doesn't get anything to eat, then her babies will starve and die. The rat population will always produce young enough so the species will survive. This is a fact that Thomas had never considered, so reluctantly he took them back carefully and placed them under an old sheet of corrugated tin to help them avoid the hawk's sharp eyes. Whether they stayed there or not, at least he'd given them a start in life, he thought. There was a loud hissing and clanking sound as a huge heavyweight steam train appeared, heading for the station from a slightly weather-worn red brick tunnel. The clouds of black and silver smoke rose high in the air, as though it had been released from a mine shaft after being trapped for some time. Thomas and his mother stood up. He picked up his suitcase and waited on the centre of the platform for the metal giant to come to a stop. He was going to his grandparents' house for the summer holidays. They'd always promised him that one day, when he was big enough, he could come and spend the summer with them without his mum and dad. He was going to be put on the train by his mother and collected at the other end by his grandparents, which meant he had the whole journey on his own. This was a little daunting, but also exciting. His father owned a fruit and vegetable stall and traded on a different local market every day of the week, except Sundays. This meant that he was often up at 4:30 in the morning, out to buy his fresh produce from the suppliers and then straight onto the market. Thomas had worked with his father a few times on the stall, but although he made a comfortable living and he was his own boss, it was not really an occupation that Thomas was keen to follow. He often wondered how his father ever managed to get up so early every day, summer and winter alike. On a few occasions when Thomas had worked on the stall, there tended to be days when the market was in his hometown, so he could just walk down in the morning without having to get up while it was still dark. This summer was going to be his summer, one where he could explore, invent and have great adventures away from home and get up when he wanted to. He would not be stuck out in cold, windswept moorlands at night or go without food for days. He wouldn't be lost in a jungle or on a desert island. He would, however, be able to go home for tea, get a warm and comfortable bed at the end of the day, so some of the risks were taken out of his adventure. His grand's cooking was second to none as far as Thomas was concerned. Her home-baked bread and cakes were a legend in the family and a must-have in his eyes. As the train pulled into the station, the driver and the fireman smiled and waved at Thomas standing on the platform. Their blackened faces from the coal soot made their teeth shine like pearls, and their lips appeared bright red as they stood on the footplate grinning. Thomas waved back and waited for the train that pulled slowly to a halt. The station master came towards Thomas and his mother and opened the door to one of the carriages. He offered to pick up Thomas's suitcase and help him into the train, but he picked up himself in an effort to show that he was independent now. His mother smiled and acknowledged his kind gesture whilst adjusting her hat and blushing slightly as she took this as a sign of attention. "Mammy always does that. He doesn't fancy her," said Thomas, laughing. "Didn't think he did, silly boy," she replied, blushing even more and tapping him on the shoulder. "Now get away with you. Remember, be good for your gran and grandpa." "I will," he replied, grinning. With a kiss on the cheek from his mother and a cuddle that took Thomas's breath away, he climbed into the compartment He'd stood on a seat so he could reach the netting rack above his head to store his suitcase. The door was slammed shut behind him. He pulled the window down and leant out to wave his mother goodbye. She'd been carrying a little brown bag all this time. Thomas had never questioned what was in it, assuming it was probably something she had packed for her lunch. But he was about to find out. "Tom," she shouted as the train started to work at the station, "I almost forgot, these are for your trip," and handed him the bag. He grabbed it, since his mother was now starting to jog to keep up with the moving train. "Thanks, ma'am," he called, after taking a firm grip of the package. She let go and stopped running. His mother then disappeared into a cloud of white smoke that by now was streaming down the platform as the train moved off. Thomas pulled the window up, sat back in his seat, and looked around the empty compartment. He was totally on his own now. On one side of him was a corridor which linked the various compartments of the train together, and where a guard appeared from to inspect his ticket. Thomas fumbled in his jacket pocket. He couldn't find it, so panicked, thinking he'd lost it. "Don't worry, son, I'm sure you have one," said the guard, with a little smile. He shook his head and disappeared as quickly as he'd arrived. Thomas pulled the ticket out of his top pocket, chuckled to himself, more relief at having found it, and sat back and looked out of the window, watching the trees and fields fly past, as the train made its way to its final destination. He was tempted to look in the brown bag, but wanted to keep it a surprise for as long as he could. He loved surprises, and Christmas was his favourite time of year, because he never really knew what he was getting. He gave enough hints, but somehow he still seemed to get presents he'd never even thought about. The train rattled along with the carriages rocking from side to side every time it crossed some points. His thoughts turned towards what lay at the end of the journey. He'd been to his grandparents' house before, but it was many years ago, and he was quite young, so it was difficult to remember exactly what it looked like. He knew their cottage was set in a little fishing village nestling in the southwest coast. There was a harbour, cliffs, a beach, some narrow streets, and that's all he could remember. His grandfather had been a fisherman for many years, but now retired, he spent most of his days walking around and sitting watching the boats come and go in the tiny harbour. Whenever his grandfather came to stay with him, the stories he told Thomas about his days at sea and the life he led always brought a smile to his face. He tried to imagine those amazing adventures and how he would have done this and that if he were with his grandfather on a little fishing vessel. He often dreamed that one day he too would have his own adventure, and today was the start of his first one. The carriage went dark as the train entered a tunnel and then back into the sunlight into what seemed an entirely different world. One minute there were countless green fields with sheep and cows, next it was rolling hills with rock faces and hamlets scattered in the distance. He pushed his face against the warm window so he could feel the heat of the sun through the pane. He then pressed his nose to the glass to make a funny face. He didn't read much normally, but this was one of those times he wished he'd brought a book. With nobody to talk to and nothing to play with, time seemed to go by slowly. He even tried to count telegraph poles as he whizzed past, but after he reached 30 he was bored. Every pole looked the same. It was almost like trying to count sheep who were into sleep. This was a pointless exercise and added little to break the monotony. He was wishing he brought some food and drink with him, since the journey was making him hungry and thirsty. After about 2 hours of travelling and the constant rhythmical clatter of the train on the track, Tommy decided it was now time to open the brown paper bag. He carefully unrolled the top and peered in. There, arranged inside, was a packet of crisps, some jam sandwiches, an apple, and the most important to him, a bottle of pop. He was so pleased that he looked at the carriage roof and shouted, "Thank you, ma'am," as if she were within earshot. He quickly unfolded the greaseproof paper and took out a great big bite of one of the sandwiches. They were his favourite, strawberry. When he finished his packed lunch, he looked at his watch and out of the window. He noticed the train was now on the coastal route of its journey, and every now and again caught glimpses of the sea. He pulled the window down a little, and in between the smoky smoke of the train, he had the salty ozone smell that confirmed the coast was nearby. Only half an hour, he thought to himself, and he would be standing on the platform with his grandparents, chattering away about what he was hoping to do during his stay. The last part of his journey seemed endless. As he became more and more excited, he was finally reaching his destination. The track now began to follow the contour of the coastline. Thomas could see the waves lapping against the seaweed-covered rocks and the coarse grasses that blanketed the headland before it disappeared into the sea, and in the distance the mountains and moorlands that formed the other part of the barrier to isolate this small community. The train was beginning to slow down as it neared its destination until finally it drew to a halt. Thomas twisted himself backwards and forwards, trying to see where they were and what was happening. Looking out of the carriage window, he could see waves lapping against the rocks. Does this mean the train had broken down? He thought to himself. He sat pondering the options. Would he have to get out with his fellow passengers and walk the rest of the way? It was a good job his mother had packed him up some food, as he now felt he had enough energy for a long walk. In fact, when he came to think about it, he had no idea how far they were away from Grandpa's village. Suddenly he had a horrific thought. What if the line was broken? They were hanging precariously over the cliff, and the engine might fall into the sea, pulling the carriages with it. He was starting to feel very faint at the idea. He was too young to die. He hadn't even had his first adventure. Was this it? Would it end before it had even begun? Just at that moment the carriage door slid open. "What's the matter, sir? Are we hanging over a cliff and all going to fall in the sea and die?" Thomas asked with a trembling lip. The guard laughed. "Well, you certainly have a good imagination for a young one. No, we're not on a cliff, nor even near it. The signal is down, which means there is still a train in front of us at the platform we want to use, so until it goes we can't get any closer." "Will it be long? I have to get to my gran. She's expecting me." "We'll be off again in a few minutes. Just sit tight and enjoy the view." He ruffled Thomas's hair, chuckled and disappeared back in the corridor. Thomas pulled the window down and took a deep breath. There was a light breeze. Suddenly there was a jolt and the train started to move once more. It was late afternoon as the train gradually pulled into the station on the outskirts of the tiny fishing port. There was a single platform with a track on both sides and a bridge connecting it to the car park. He pulled the window down and looked out. The cry of seagulls and the aroma of fish were stark reminders of his location. Amidst the smoke, standing on the platform, there were two elderly figures waiting. He could just make out the shapes and realised that this must be his welcome party. The train groaned and creaked as it finally came to a stop. The guard moved methodically down the train, opening carriage doors. Arriving at Thomas's compartment, the door swung open. Thomas stood on the seat to lift his suitcase down from the rope racking. "You can't stand on our seats, young un," said a voice with a strong West Country accent. He turned to face the open door, and looking down he saw the guard grinning at him. "I'm sorry, but I can't reach my case house," he replied. The guard laughed and stepped inside to help Thomas lift it down. "Now take your time, and mind your step when you get off. We don't want to be carrying you off the platform with a broken leg, do we?" Thomas stepped onto the platform, followed by the guard carrying the suitcase. His grandmother rushed up to him, grabbed him tight and gave him the biggest hug he'd ever had. It was as though he were a long-lost relative whom she'd never seen for years. The truth was only a few months ago he had stayed with him, and at that time discussed the summer holiday break with him. "My little Tom, I'm glad to see you," she cried with excitement. Thomas winced and he looked at the top. And he just travelled his arm in his heart all the way to stay with him. "How are you, my boy?" his grandfather asked as he rubbed Thomas's hair, as that was the only part of his body that came up to the grips of his grandmother's bear. She kissed him on the forehead, and the guard passed the kiss to his grandfather. "I see somebody's pleased to see you, young un. Is this your summer holidays then? You'll be having a right good time here, I reckon. Plenty of that," he said, laughing. old cottages that had been bombed during the war and now been converted to stores and such like. As they stepped out of the car, Thomas's grandfather asked him to help pull a large blue tarpaulin over the car to protect it. "Does the roof leak, Grandad?" asked Thomas. "No," said his grandfather, smiling. "It's to help stop the salty sea air from corroding Betsy." This was the name he'd given to his car, and was the name of his first fishing boat. The garage door was locked and bolted, and the three of them walked across the road, down a very narrow passageway until they came to a red-painted door. Hanging above the doorway was a rusty horseshoe. "Gran, why's you got a rusty horseshoe hanging over the door?" asked Thomas. "It's for good luck, Tom. When your grandfather brought it home and we put it above the door to bring us luck, and sure enough that same year you were born." "Do you know it has to hang so the prongs is upwards?" she asked. Thomas shook his head, looking at her, waiting for an answer. "It keeps the luck inside. When it falls upside down, all the luck falls out." "Ain't you scared it'll fall off the wall and all the luck will fall out?" said Thomas. "It won't," asked his grandfather, laughing. "I've glued it to the wall as well as the nails that's holding it on." Thomas laughed along with his gran at the reply. His grandma pushed open the old cottage door and went inside. "First job is to ring your mum and tell her you arrived in one piece, then we've a treat for a young un," said his grandfather. He rang and told his mother he had arrived safely and thanked her for the sandwiches and pop, but said he had to go because his grandfather wanted to show him something. He replaced the receiver and turned to his grandpa. "Okay, I'm ready now." "Follow me," he replied. His grandfather picked up Thomas's suitcase and made his way up the winding staircase with its white stone-washed walls, eagerly followed by Thomas. His gran went into the kitchen to put the kettle on. At the top of the stairs, on the landing, they stopped outside an old oak door with large blackened hinges. His grandfather nodded in the direction of the door. "Go on, young, and open it," he said. Thomas looked at him and then back at the door. Slowly he pushed the door open and gasped,